Spread your legs and put your hands on the damn hood, the officer barked, his hand resting menacingly on the grip of his service weapon. Rain misted in the harsh glare of the streetlights, catching the spit flying from the officer's lips. The man in the bespoke charcoal suit didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or break eye contact. "Officer," he replied, his voice a calm, chilling baritone that cut through the noise of the city street. "I highly suggest you reconsider this course of action. You are making a mistake you cannot undo." "Shut your mouth, boy!" Officer Blake Howard sneered, violently grabbing the man's expensive lapels and shoving him backward. He had no idea the wrists he was about to lock in iron belonged to the very man sent by the federal government to dismantle his entire corrupt precinct. The humid night air of Atlanta hung thick and heavy over the upscale district of Buckhead, pressing down like a physical weight. Neon lights from high-end boutiques and luxury car dealerships reflected off the rain-slicked pavement, casting long, distorted shadows that danced in the puddles. Standing beneath the grand, gold-leafed awning of the St. Regis Hotel was Patrick Moore. He was a picture of absolute stillness amidst the bustling, chaotic energy of the city. At 45, Patrick carried himself with an effortless authority, an aura born from decades of high-stakes legal battles, prosecuting domestic terrorists, and an unwavering moral compass. His reputation as a legal surgeon in the DOJ's Civil Rights Division was legendary. He was known for dismantling corrupt police departments from the inside out. Tonight, however, he was strictly off the clock. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal grey Oswald Boateng suit that draped flawlessly over his athletic, disciplined frame. His tie was a subtle maroon silk, perfectly knotted, and on his left wrist rested a vintage Patek Philippe Calatrava, a deeply personal gift from the Attorney General of the United States upon his latest promotion to Deputy Director. Patrick was simply waiting. His wife, Elena, was inside the grand ballroom of the hotel attending a high-profile charity gala, and he had stepped out for a moment to catch a breath of fresh air and wait for the valet to bring around their rented Mercedes-Benz S-Class. 2 blocks away, rolling slowly through the neon-lit streets in a marked Ford Police Interceptor, was Officer Blake Howard. Blake was a 15-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, a man whose career was defined by a long, dark string of excessive force complaints that had miraculously always vanished into the administrative ether. Blake was a relic of a bygone era, a bitter, deeply prejudiced man who viewed the city not as a community to serve, but as an occupied territory to control. He had survived internal affairs investigations by exploiting union loopholes and relying on a blue wall of silence that was finally beginning to crack. He despised the rapid gentrification of the city, but more than that, he harbored a deep-seated toxic resentment towards successful minorities. To Blake, the world was a strict hierarchy, and he firmly believed he belonged at the absolute top by virtue of his badge, his gun, and the color of his skin. As the cruiser slowly rounded the corner onto West Paces Ferry Road, Blake's eyes locked onto the glowing entrance of the St. Regis. Specifically, they locked onto Patrick Moore. Blake's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning stark white against the black leather. His mind, conditioned by years of unchecked bias, immediately went to the darkest, most cynical assumptions. He didn't see a highly successful, educated man waiting for a luxury car. He saw an anomaly that deeply offended his worldview. He saw a black man in a suit that cost more than Blake made in a month, standing outside a hotel where Blake couldn't afford to buy a single cocktail. "Look at this guy," Blake muttered to himself, the leather of his duty belt creaking loudly as he shifted his weight in the driver's seat. "Thinks he owns the damn place? Probably running a high-end escort ring out of the penthouse or pushing weight out of a rented suite." There was absolutely zero evidence of any crime. There was no radio call for service, no dispatcher warning of suspicious activity. There was only a man breathing the night air and checking his watch. But for Blake Howard, personal bias was all the probable cause he ever needed. He aggressively flicked on the cruiser's light bar, the blinding red and blue flashes slicing violently through the elegant, warm ambience of the hotel entrance. He pulled the heavy, armoured vehicle sharply to the curb, intentionally jumping the concrete to block the valet lane, and killed the engine. The hunt was on, and Blake was ready to assert his dominance on the street. He stepped out of the vehicle, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his Glock 22, squaring his shoulders and adjusting his posture to look as broad and intimidating as legally possible. He was about to make the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his life. Patrick Moore watched the heavy police cruiser mount the curb with mild curiosity, which over the span of 3 seconds quickly hardened into a cold, highly analytical focus as the officer stepped out. Patrick had spent his entire adult life studying the law, prosecuting systemic corruption, and holding the powerful, badge-wearing abusers accountable. He instantly recognized the aggressive strut, the hand hovering nervously over the level 3 retention holster, the jutted jaw of a bully looking for a victim. It was a posture he had seen 100 times in grainy body cam footage during late-night civil rights investigations. "Hey, you!" Blake barked, his voice echoing off the concrete architecture as he closed the distance rapidly. His heavy tactical boots struck the pavement with deliberate, intimidating force. "Turn around and let me see your hands right now." Patrick did not turn. He did not flinch. He simply shifted his weight slightly, keeping his hands perfectly visible, resting lightly and unthreateningly in front of him. His expression remained utterly impassive, a mask of total calm. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem I can assist you with?" "I ask the damn questions here," Blake snapped, stepping aggressively into Patrick's personal space, violating the unwritten rules of conversational distance. The smell of stale coffee, cheap chewing tobacco, and old sweat wafted off the officer's polyester uniform. "What are you doing loitering outside this hotel? Who exactly are you waiting for?" "I am a guest of the hotel, and I am currently waiting for my vehicle to be brought to the front," Patrick replied, his voice maintaining a steady, perfectly modulated conversational volume. He made no sudden movements, knowing exactly how this game was played. "Am I suspected of committing a crime this evening?" Blake's eyes narrowed into slits. He absolutely hated when subjects knew the legal terminology. It didn't make him cautious, it only fueled his irrational, simmering anger. "I got a report of suspicious activity in the area. A guy matching your exact description, scoping out luxury cars. Let me see your ID. Now, pull it out slowly." It was a blatant, fabricated lie, and Patrick knew it instantly. "Officer," Patrick said smoothly, his tone shifting from conversational to distinctly academic, "under Terry versus Ohio, you are required by the Constitution to have articulable, reasonable suspicion that I am committing, have committed, or am about to commit a crime in order to legally detain me. Standing outside a hotel waiting for a valet does not meet that legal standard. Therefore, this is a consensual encounter, and I respectfully decline to provide my identification." The pinpoint legal precision of the response hit Blake like a physical blow to the chest. The veins in his thick neck bulged violently against his tightly fastened collar, his face flushing a dangerous, mottled red. The sheer arrogance of this man. How dare this civilian quote Supreme Court case law to him on his own streets? In Blake's twisted, authoritarian worldview, respect meant absolute, unquestioning submission, regardless of the law. "Listen to me, you arrogant piece of work," Blake sneered, stepping closer until his spit flew to land on the lapel of Patrick's impeccable suit. "You're not in some fancy courtroom, and you're not on a TV show. You're on my street. And on my street, when I ask for your ID, you hand it over immediately, or I take you downtown for obstructing an active police investigation." "I am not obstructing anything," Patrick said, his eyes locking dead onto Blake's. Patrick's gaze was piercing, an unyielding, terrifying wall of intellect and federal authority. "I am simply exercising my fundamental constitutional rights. If you have no lawful, articulable reason to detain me, I am going to end this conversation right now and walk back inside the hotel." Patrick took a slow, highly deliberate half-step toward the warm, glowing glass doors of the St. Regis. It was a perfectly legal move, a calculated test to see if the officer would escalate a clearly unlawful detention into a physical, criminal assault. Blake's fragile ego snapped entirely. The mere thought of this man turning his back and walking away, dismissing his authority like a pesky, irrelevant insect, was intolerable. He saw red. Rational thought vanished into the humid night, replaced entirely by the primal, ugly urge to physically dominate and humiliate his perceived inferior. "I said stop right there!" Blake roared, lunging forward with both hands. Without warning, Blake's heavy, calloused hands clamped down violently on Patrick's shoulders, the officer's thick fingers digging painfully into the fine wool of the suit jacket. With a sudden violent jerk that strained the seams of the fabric, Blake spun Patrick around and shoved him hard against the steel quarter panel of the Ford Interceptor. The impact knocked the wind out of Patrick, his cheek pressing uncomfortably against the cold, wet metal of the police car, the flashing lights reflecting intensely in his eyes. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting right now!" Blake screamed at the top of his lungs, a loud, highly calculated performance designed solely to justify the incoming violence for any nearby witnesses or his own dashcam. "I am completely compliant," Patrick said, his voice strained from the awkward angle but remarkably steady. He did not struggle. He did not attempt to fight back or leverage his own considerable strength. Every instinct in his body, honed by years of strict legal discipline and tactical training, told him to let the corrupt officer hang himself with his own rope. He let his body go entirely limp, offering absolutely zero physical resistance, which perversely only seemed to infuriate Blake further. Blake roughly yanked Patrick's arms behind his back, wrenching the left shoulder upward at an excruciating, unnatural angle. The sharp, ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply in the night air. Blake squeezed them tight, punishingly, maliciously tight, the teeth of the cuffs biting past the skin, ensuring the metal dug violently into Patrick's wrists, resting brutally right over the leather band of the priceless Patek Philippe, threatening to shatter the delicate sapphire crystal. A crowd had rapidly begun to gather. Wealthy patrons in evening gowns and tuxedos spilling out of the St. Regis paused on the steps, their champagne-fueled laughter dying instantly. Valets in their crisp, tailored uniforms stood frozen, and pedestrians walking down West Pace's Ferry Road all stopped to watch the spectacle. Within seconds, a dozen smartphones were already raised in the air, their glowing camera lenses capturing every second of the scene in high definition. "Look at this! We got a real smart guy here tonight," Blake announced loudly, playing to the gathering crowd while simultaneously trying to intimidate them into silence. "Thinks he can case luxury cars in my city and quote law to me. You are executing a false arrest, officer," Patrick stated calmly, turning his head slightly to ensure the surrounding cell phone microphones caught his clear, unpanicked, heavily authoritative voice. "You have committed criminal battery and you are actively depriving me of my civil rights under colour of law. I am documenting every single word you say and every action you take." "Document this, smartass," Blake whispered harshly, leaning in close so only Patrick could hear before shoving his heavy knee hard into the back of Patrick's legs to force him to stumble and lose his footing. Blake violently grabbed the chain connecting the handcuffs and practically dragged the suited, stumbling man to the back door of the cruiser. He shoved Patrick aggressively into the hard plastic rear seat, intentionally pushing the crown of his head down with enough malicious force to bounce Patrick's chin painfully off his chest. The heavy, reinforced door slammed shut with a sickening, final thud. Inside the cruiser, the environment was suffocating. The smell of bleach, old vomit, and unwashed bodies was overwhelming in the confined space. The slick, hard plastic seat offered no traction or comfort, and the over-tightened cuffs were rapidly cutting off the circulation to Patrick's hands, making his fingers tingle with numbness. Blake slid confidently into the driver's seat, panting slightly from the exertion, a triumphant, ugly smirk plastered broadly across his face. He looked at Patrick through the smeared, reinforced plexiglass partition that separated the front from the back. "You see, that's your problem," Blake said, aggressively putting the car in drive and tearing away from the curb, his tires squealing against the wet pavement. "You get a little bit of money, you put on a fancy bespoke suit, and you think the rules of the street don't apply to you. You think you can talk down to me. I'm the law in this town. I decide who walks home and who rides in the cage." Patrick sat in the suffocating darkness of the back seat, the flashing lights illuminating his stoic, unreadable face in brief, violent bursts of red and blue. He didn't say a single word. He didn't need to argue. He simply stared at the back of the officer's head, memorized the badge number, 7442, and clinically calculated exactly how many federal statutes, department policies, and civil rights laws Blake Howard had just brazenly violated. The steel trap was set, and the arrogant prey had walked right in, locking the door behind him. The rough, erratic ride to the 4th Precinct was a sickening masterclass in total unprofessionalism. Blake spent the entire 20-minute drive gloating to his captive audience, delivering a rambling, offensive monologue filled with thinly veiled racial slurs, political grievances, and arrogant boasts about how he cleaned up the trash off the streets. Patrick listened in absolute, terrifying silence, operating as a human tape recorder, meticulously gathering the verbal evidence that would soon burn Blake's 15-year career to absolute ash. The cruiser lurched violently to a halt in the dimly lit, pothole-riddled back alley of the precinct. Blake hauled Patrick out of the back seat by the handcuff chain, dragging him up the cracked concrete stairs and shoving him through the heavy metal doors into the bustling booking area. The precinct was a chaotic, depressing symphony of ringing landlines, shouting officers processing petty criminals, and the metallic, hollow clatter of holding cell doors slamming shut. The air smelled of stale sweat, cheap floor wax, and despair. Desk Sergeant Miller, an older, weary-looking cop with a grey moustache and bags under his eyes, looked up from his mountain of paperwork. He took one long look at Patrick. The clearly expensive suit, the composed, icy demeanour, the absolute chilling lack of fear that usually accompanied a suspect in cuffs, and then looked at Blake's aggressive, overly triumphant posture. A sudden, deep, cold feeling of existential dread washed over Miller. Miller had spent 30 years on the force. He knew the difference between a corner boy putting on airs and a man who held true, devastating power. "What do we have here, Howard?" Miller asked, his voice noticeably hesitant, his pen hovering over the logbook. "Got a live one tonight, Sarge." Blake laughed cruelly, shoving Patrick hard toward the scuffed booking counter. "Loitering outside the St. Regis, casing cars in the valet line. Refused to ID, resisted arrest, disorderly conduct. The usual garbage trying to act upper class to get out of a charge." Miller ignored Blake and looked directly at Patrick. "Sir, can I get your name for the record?" "I will provide my name to the commanding officer of this precinct and no one else," Patrick said. His voice didn't just echo off the cinder-block walls. It carried a dense, heavy authority that made the entire room fall suddenly, uncomfortably quiet. Several other officers processing perps turned around to look at the man in the charcoal suit. "Furthermore, under departmental policy and state law, I am entitled to my phone call. I will take it now." Blake scoffed loudly, stepping forward to physically shove Patrick again to assert dominance in front of his peers. "You don't make demands in my house." "Howard, back the hell off!" Sergeant Miller barked, jumping to his feet so fast his chair rolled backward into a filing cabinet. Miller's survival instincts were screaming at deafening volumes that something was horribly, irreversibly wrong. This wasn't a street hustler. This man stood in the centre of the booking room like a 5-star general who had just calmly walked into an enemy camp. "Let him make his phone call. Get the damn cuffs off him right now." Blake glared at Miller, his pride wounded, but reluctantly pulled his keys and unlocked the cuffs. Patrick rubbed his wrist slowly, feeling the deep, angry red indentations left by the over-tightened steel. He didn't rub his skin frantically or complain about the pain. His movements were deliberate, precise, and almost menacing in their absolute calm. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket, retrieved his sleek smartphone, and dialed a number. He didn't call a local, high-priced defense attorney. He didn't call a 24-hour bail bondsman. He dialed a direct, highly classified, encrypted line straight to the governor's mansion. The room was dead silent. The ringing phones seemed to fade into the background as everyone watched the man in the charcoal suit. "Yes, it's more." Patrick spoke into the phone, his voice crystal clear and devoid of any panic. "The Atlanta precinct audit just shifted from a passive review to an active, live investigation. I am currently standing inside the booking area of the 4th precinct. I have just been falsely arrested, battered, and subjected to blatant racial profiling by an Officer Blake Howard. Yes, deploy the DOJ Strike Task Force immediately. Have the Chief of Police and the FBI Special Agent in charge meet me at this exact location within 20 minutes. Seal the entire building. No one leaves, no data is to be deleted." He hung up the phone with a soft click and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked directly at Blake, whose smug, arrogant smile was rapidly beginning to falter, replaced by a nervous twitch of utter confusion. "What kind of pathetic bluff is that?" Blake sneered, though his voice notably lacked its previous booming volume, a slight tremor betraying his sudden anxiety. "You calling your imaginary lawyer friends to scare us?" Patrick didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He simply folded his hands neatly in front of him, planted his feet, and waited. The clock was ticking. The die was cast, and the storm was coming. For 30 agonizing, suffocating minutes, the 4th precinct existed in a bizarre state of suspended animation. Blake tried desperately to busy himself by loudly and aggressively typing up his fabricated arrest report, making sure to hit the keys hard as he exaggerated Patrick's aggressive combat stance and repeated verbal threats. Sergeant Miller simply sat at his desk and stared at Patrick, a massive pit of anxiety forming in his stomach. The man in the bespoke suit hadn't moved a single inch. He hadn't asked for a cup of water, hadn't complained about the wait, hadn't paced the floor. He was as terrifyingly, beautifully patient as a spider waiting in the center of a finely spun web. Then, the tense quiet was violently shattered. Outside, the heavy synchronized roar of multiple high-performance engines echoed deafeningly in the narrow alleyway. The sharp screech of tactical tires on wet pavement was immediately followed by the rapid, percussive slamming of heavy, armored SUV doors. The main double doors of the precinct didn't just open. They were violently thrown apart, the heavy reinforced glass shuddering in its metal frame. In strode Chief of Police Thomas, his dress uniform crisp but his face pale as a ghost and dripping with nervous, cold sweat. Flanking him in a tight tactical diamond formation were 6 individuals wearing dark suits and heavy Kevlar tactical vests emblazoned with 3 bright yellow, terrifying letters, FBI. Walking briskly behind them, looking furious, was the mayor's chief of staff. The entire precinct stood up in unison. Officers froze mid-sentence with their suspects. The clatter of keyboards ceased instantly, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Chief Thomas scanned the room frantically, his eyes darting from face to face until they landed on Patrick Moore, standing calmly near the booking desk. The chief looked like he was about to be physically sick. His career flashed before his eyes, every overlooked excessive force complaint suddenly a nail in his own coffin. He practically sprinted across the linoleum room, ignoring every subordinate officer in his path. "Mr. Moore!" Chief Thomas gasped out, stopping 3 feet away, breathless and trembling. I have no words to adequately express my horror. I am profoundly, deeply sorry for this unconscionable breach of conduct. Are you injured, sir? Do you need me to call for a paramedic?" Blake Howard stood up slowly from his desk, his jaw dropping so far it practically hit his chest. The fabricated arrest report he was holding slipped completely from his suddenly numb fingers, the pages scattering chaotically onto the floor. "Chief!" Blake stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Chief, wait, this guy is a suspect. He was casing cars at the St. Regis." "Shut your damn mouth, Howard!" the chief roared, turning on him with a primal, terrified fury that physically shook the windows of the precinct. "Do not say another word, you absolute, monumental fool." The lead FBI agent stepped forward, his cold eyes locked dead onto Blake. "Officer Blake Howard, step away from the computer terminal immediately. Keep your hands where I can plainly see them, or this will escalate." Blake raised his trembling hands instinctively, his mind spinning uncontrollably into a panicked void. What the hell is going on? Who is this guy? Patrick Moore finally broke his silence. He took one deliberate step forward, the sheer, crushing weight of his presence dominating every inch of the room. "My name," Patrick said, his voice ringing out like a heavy judge's gavel striking the bench, "is Patrick Moore. I am the newly appointed Deputy Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. For the past 6 months, my team and I have been directing a covert, comprehensive federal investigation into systemic corruption, illegal racial profiling, and widespread civil rights abuses within this very precinct. We were looking for the rot hiding behind the badges. Tonight, Officer Howard, you didn't just prove our thesis. You handed your entire career to me on a silver platter." The colour completely drained from Blake's face, leaving him looking sickly and grey. His knees visibly buckled slightly. The arrogant, untouchable street cop who thought he owned the city suddenly realised he had just violently assaulted and unlawfully arrested the federal executioner sent specifically to dismantle his kingdom. "Officer Howard," Patrick continued, walking slowly and deliberately toward the trembling, defeated cop, "you conducted an unlawful stop without a shred of articulable, reasonable suspicion. You escalated to criminal battery. You effectuated a false, malicious arrest. You falsified an official police report, which I watched you type on that screen with your own hands. And you committed a violent deprivation of rights under colour of law, a severe federal felony under Title 18 United States Code, Section 242. Patrick stopped just inches from Blake, staring down into the man's terrified eyes. "You thought my suit was a costume. You thought my skin color gave you inherent permission to play God on these streets. You were catastrophically wrong." Chief Thomas stepped forward, his voice shaking with anger and fear of federal reprisal. "Blake Howard, surrender your duty weapon, your taser, and your badge right now. You are immediately and permanently stripped of all police powers." "Chief, please, you have to help me," Blake begged, his voice a pathetic, whimpering whine, a stark and embarrassing contrast to the monstrous bully he had been just an hour ago. "I made a mistake, that's all. He was acting suspicious, I swear. I have a pension, Chief. I have 15 years of service on the force. You can't let the feds do this to me over one misunderstanding." "I'm not doing anything to you," the chief said coldly, stepping back to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. "You did every single bit of this to yourself." Two burly FBI agents moved in seamlessly. They didn't ask nicely, and they didn't afford him professional courtesy. They grabbed Blake's arms with the exact same violent, unyielding force Blake had used on Patrick earlier that night. They slammed him hard against the cinderblock wall. The sharp mechanical sound of Blake's own department-issued handcuffs being ratcheted tightly onto his wrists echoed poetically through the utterly silent precinct. "Officer Howard," the lead FBI agent whispered coldly into his ear, reading him the rights he had denied so many others. "You have the right to remain silent. Looking at the federal charges you're facing, I highly suggest you finally use it." They aggressively stripped his heavy-duty belt from his waist. They reached forward and pulled the silver shield from his chest, tossing it onto the desk. Blake Howard, the former terror of the Buckhead streets, was instantly reduced to a weeping, broken, pathetic man being frog-marched out of his own precinct in absolute disgrace, right in front of all his stunned peers. In the long, grueling months that followed, the karma was absolute, public, and devastating. The bodycam footage, which Patrick's federal agents had immediately seized from the precinct servers before it could be accidentally deleted, leaked and went spectacularly viral. It showcased Blake's unhinged racism and unprovoked violence in undeniable high definition. The city administration, terrified of the DOJ, refused to provide him with legal defense. The police union, taking one look at the DOJ's impenetrable mountain of evidence, issued a public statement condemning him and abandoned him immediately to save their own skins. Blake's pension was immediately frozen and subsequently revoked entirely under a newly enacted municipal corruption clause he had once mocked. The federal trial was swift and merciless. He was convicted by a jury of his peers on multiple federal counts of civil rights violations, battery and falsifying official records, and was sentenced to 8 hard years in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant man who loved to throw defenseless people into cages was now locked in a very real one himself, a disgraced, widely hated ex-cop with a massive target on his back. As for Patrick Moore, he had returned to the elegant St. Regis that very same night, greeting his wife with a warm kiss, just as the gala was ending. He hadn't even bothered to change his suit. The hard work of cleaning up the city was really just beginning. But as he looked out over the glittering skyline of Atlanta, he knew with absolute certainty that the streets were already just a little bit safer. Wow, what an absolutely massive, deeply satisfying dose of instant karma. Officer Blake Howard truly believed he was completely above the law, a king of his own streets, but he ended up slapping his own handcuffs onto the very federal official who held the keys to his utter destruction. It just goes to show you, blind arrogance and toxic prejudice will always eventually lead to your own spectacular downfall, and you never truly know who you are messing with in the dark. If you loved seeing justice served ice cold and watching a corrupt, arrogant buller finally getting exactly the devastating punishment he deserved, do me a huge favor and smash that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and pushes these stories of justice out to more people. Drop a comment down below. What would you have done if you were in Patrick Moore's shoes that night? Would you have been able to stay that incredibly calm while being falsely arrested? Do you think 8 years in federal prison was enough of a sentence for Officer Howard? Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a good revenge story, and definitely hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another dramatic story of instant karma, sweet revenge, and absolute justice. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.